Welcome to Programming with Professor Califf. Today I want to talk a bit about files and programming. Why should we care about using files? First, files are what allow our programs to remember things from one run of the program to the next, even if all we want to do is remember the high scores from a simple game or store some user preferences. We need a file to do that in. Second, using files makes it much easier to provide large amounts of data to a program. People make mistakes when typing. If we have a file, we can more easily get the mistakes fixed and get large amounts of data into our program. And if we need to enter the same data in different program runs, we may be saving a lot of work by people. Then, of course, many programs are about creating files. In order to create this video, I used a program to create the slides you see, and a different program to plan and store what I need to say. The whole point of each of those programs is creating the files to store that information. There are a couple of different kinds of files that we use with computer programs. One of those is text files, where data is stored in a standard character encoding, like the one we use in our programs. These files can be read and interpreted by any program or human because the data is just text. Of course, we don't always want just any program to be able to read and understand our files, and numeric data becomes quite bulky. If I want to store the number 2,049,102,691 in text, it'll take me 10 bytes, assuming no commas. But I may store it in the computer in no more than 4 bytes, typically 8 bytes at the very most. The alternative is to use binary files. These are files where we actually store the data in the file in the same format we use inside the computer. We have to know the exact format of the file in order to interpret it, just like the computer has to know the type of a variable in order to interpret the data stored in it. In general, less space will be required for non-character data in a binary file. If you're curious to see what a binary file might look like, simply open something like a Word document with Notepad, which only reads text data, and you'll see a lot of gobbledygook. That's the indication that a lot of the Word document format is in fact binary file. No matter what kind of files we're dealing with, there are going to be 4 primary operations that we're going to need to worry about. First, we need to open files. When we open a file, our program works with the operating system to give us access to the file and set it up for reading and/or writing. Of course, we need to be able to read from files. We need to be able to write data to our files. And finally, we need to be able to close files. That's important because we need to let the operating system know that we're done with the file. But it's extra important when we're writing to files. You see, reading from and writing to files is a bit more complicated than you might think, mostly because input and output are expensive, much more time-consuming than other things we do in our programs. So we don't actually write each item directly to the file. Instead, the computer reads a big chunk of data, usually called a page or a disk block, into something called the input buffer. And then our commands to read from the file are actually reading from that input buffer, which you can think of as a kind of an array. The same kind of thing happens when we write to a file. We're actually writing each item to an output buffer. Now here's the tricky part. The output buffer will only get written to the file when it fills up completely or when the program tells it to write what it has out to the file. We call that flushing the buffer because the buffer is emptied out to the file. When we close a file in most programming languages, the buffer is automatically flushed. But if we're writing along and then quit our program without actually closing the file first, it's quite possible that the data we wrote to the file never actually went to it. It's still in the buffer, but hasn't been flushed out to the file. So anytime you're writing to a file and the data is not in the file, make sure you actually close the file in your program. Thanks for watching. I know this video was all concepts. In the next video, I'll talk about how we actually read from text files.